Joining us now to talk about President Obama, someone who intimately knew another president of the United States, Michael Reagan. It is so good to have you back here on America's Forum. Welcome to our program.
Good to be with you, JD.
So, Michael, look, everyone needs a vacation, but the notion of the president coming in, getting in his lecture mode, and then going back on the golf links, does this really overload the image in a negative way for the current president?
Well, I think it just keeps the image going that he's just disengaged, this president. And he doesn't understand perception and reality. I understand that wherever the President of the United States is, he's got everything he needs to be in contact with anybody he wants to talk to around the globe. I understand that. But you've got to also understand perception. How do people perceive you when you're on a golf course when the world is falling apart around you? I remember my father back in the 1980s, that young man who, the Navy gentleman who was thrown off of an airplane, TWA flight that had been hijacked, I think in Brussels or someplace of that nature. My father was prepared to go to the ranch with Nancy to celebrate her birthday, July 6th. But he understood the perception of, if I go to the ranch to celebrate Nancy's birthday while this is going on, then they're going to think I'm really disengaged. So he stayed in Washington, D.C., and finished and followed through with what was going on around the globe. And we celebrated Nancy's birthday that year in August, and we celebrated her birthday every year from that point forward in August during the August recess. So again, the President of the United States needs to understand what the perception is from us regular folk out here who's saying, wait a minute, you need to come off the golf course. You need to be engaged in Washington with Americans being killed in such a brutal way as that, and others like Sotloff and others being, in fact, threatened to be killed in the same way. The golf course is not where the President of the United States belongs.
Just to close the loop, the event you talked about during your father's presidency, the hijacking of a TWA international flight, the sailor who was killed, his name was Robert Stetham. And the broader point is your dad stayed on the job. Now we have this horrific situation where Mr. Foley was beheaded, and apparently British intelligence believes it is a British national that engaged in this. And we have, what, over 100 American passports in the possession of those, it is believed, in the Middle East involved with jihadists. Again, a comparison and a contrast. There is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron, canceling his vacation because the executioner had a British accent. A very different reaction in the UK than what we're seeing from our chief executive here in the US.
Well, David Cameron understands perception. The reality, this is not the time that you take a vacation when these types of things are in fact happening. You know, the question that keeps on not being asked, where did ISIS come from? Who trained ISIS? Where were they trained? And what were they supposed to do with that training? And the reality is, I think you're back to almost a Fast and Furious situation where we supplied weapons to the cartels in Mexico who end up killing, a border guard. Isn't the United States of America the ones responsible for training ISIS in Jordan to go into Syria and take care of the problems in Syria, and now they've gone off the mark? I mean, it's like nobody wants to be responsible for those people, in fact, we train. And those questions need to be asked: where they came from, who trained them, why they were trained, and what made them get out of hand. And they need not to be contained, they need to be killed.
Well, as you set that up, again, connecting the dots, Michael Reagan, it's one of the reasons we appreciate having you on this program, to think beyond to the next step and understand what is past is prologue. Of course, yesterday on this program, we had Congressman Ted Poe, and he talked about the operational similarities between the Mexican cartels and ISIS and other Middle Eastern groups, at least in terms of using that brutal tactic of beheading, which brings us full circle back to the contrast of that brutality and the comparative tranquility of our current president's vacation and his time on the golf links. My old colleague in the House, Joe Scarborough, now over on MSNBC, also weighed in on Mr. Obama's golfing excursion. Let's listen to what Joe had to say.
This is how they make their money, right?
Right.
This is Al Qaeda funded their operations by kidnapping Europeans and getting ransom money, right? And so they are negotiating with Spock with a pitching wedge. And I'm sure there may even be one or two, like, terrorists, Willie, over in Syria right now looking at him going, wow, that's one cold bastard. I mean, like, he goes golfing on Martha's Vineyard. And by the way, people might be watching going, are you criticizing the president or not? I don't know what I'm doing.
Well, aside from that exculpatory note to MSNBC viewers at the end of that observation, there is Scarborough, to a certain degree, trying to connect the dots and to get the responses of those who are engaged in their nefarious activities in the Middle East. The president so often comes in, this president in particular tries to sound authoritative, almost professorial. Your dad took a very different approach, resolute but conversational. What would be the Reagan rule book on being presidential?
Well, if Muammar Gaddafi were alive, he could tell you very much what the rule book would be from Ronald Reagan being presidential, because he had to live under it as the head there in Libya back in the day. But it's not what would Ronald Reagan do, because I don't think we'd be in this position if Ronald Reagan were president of the United States. I don't think we'd be in this position if George W. Bush were president of the United States, because they would be absolutely engaged in what, in fact, was going on. But I think another question that needs to be asked is, what about human intel? What happened to human intel? The fact that, now the White House is leaking information. Well, we tried to save this guy. We tried to go in there, but he just wasn't there when we showed up. Why wasn't he there when you showed up? What happened to human intel? The whole infrastructure of this government has absolutely disintegrated, under this president, because he has not been engaged in what he needs to be engaged in the United States of America. Remember, the president of the United States is, well, you served in Congress. Congress really controls what's going on domestically, but the president of the United States is the lead guy, when you talk about international. Well, this guy's disengaged everywhere, and the world is paying the price for that. That's why in Russia today, they uplift Vladimir Putin, because when you look around the globe, only leader in the world is Vladimir Putin.
Michael, you touched briefly on the curious release of the information yesterday from the Pentagon about that failed rescue attempt. I think a lot of people are very concerned about that, because it's something you don't talk about because of operational security. And in the minute and a half that remains, Michael Reagan, is this simply incompetence on the part of our president, or apathy, or an antipathy toward our military and past events in American history?
Because this president, it's always been about him. It's never been about us. It's been about him. And so that's why he can go play golf, feel very good on the golf course. I'd like to see what his score is and if he takes mulligans on the golf course. But it is about him. We need a president who's elected that's about us, not about themselves. And that's one of the problems you face with this president of the United States. So he puts people in place who only kowtow to him, not kowtow to the people who, in fact, they represent, which is the United States of America and all of her citizens.
Well said. Michael Reagan from California, we thank you for your time as you join us via satellite from Los Angeles. Your insights and analysis are always on the mark, and that's why we appreciate having you on so much. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, you heard what Michael Reagan has to say, and he has a unique perspective, having been the son of the 40th President of the United States. Do you agree with Michael about our current president? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #AmericasForum. You can also find us at the following address, newsmaxtv.com/comment. And don't forget Facebook. You can go to facebook.com/Newsmax. There is much more ahead as America's Forum rolls on for this Thursday, here on Newsmax TV.